Shalom from Jerusalem. I am Shani Ferguson, and it is incredibly hot outside. In fact, we have broken records this week at night, 36 degrees Celsius, which is the hottest ever recorded in Israel since they've been recording. Last night was 34 degrees in Jerusalem, which is also very, very hot because we are a desert land. In the evenings, it always cools down regardless of how hot it gets, and it was some 51 degrees recorded in a lot. So we're filming indoors today. And so here's some of the current events and some of the ridiculous things that are happening in our country, in our region. Number one, a film festival in Toronto has canceled the viewing of an October 7th documentary. Why? Because some of the footage used in the documentary was filmed by Hamas terrorists as they murdered and kidnapped Israelis and foreigners and Arabs alike. The festival organizers said that the documentary producers did not obtain the proper permissions from Hamas to use their footage, even though they freely put their footage on social media platforms and a variety of other pirated websites. The other ridiculous thing that has been happening recently, which has only harmed the negotiations and attempts to end the war and return our hostages, has been the European leaders who have declared they want to recognize a Palestinian state. So I'll explain why this is both living in fantasy land and unhelpful, because we were in the middle of negotiations with Hamas for the release of the hostages and the end of the war when the French president declared that he would recognize a Palestinian state. That day, Hamas shut off any negotiations and said, thank you, no thank you. We're clearly getting what we want from the West. So now we have yet another delay in the release of the hostages because of Western hero syndrome that isn't in touch with reality. And why is it not in touch with reality? Because declaring a Palestinian state would mean what? What borders? What government? Are we going to put Hamas now in charge of the people that they're slaughtering? And by people they're slaughtering, I'm not even talking about the hostages. I'm talking about Gazans. In fact, there were representatives that went to Gaza this past week and interviewed Gazans, went to check out the whole humanitarian aid crisis supposedly thing that's happening, and was shocked to find out that Gazans actually held more animosity towards Hamas than they did IDF soldiers. Why? Because most of them, he said, had some family member that had been murdered by Hamas, not IDF soldiers. And so why the French president thought that this would somehow help the Gazan people, I'm not sure. However, other countries saw him from the side and said, yes, let's do this thing. Let's look like the heroes of the world, at least for right now, because all that matters in politics apparently is the moment. And so Canada joined in and said, yes, we also want to recognize this mythical Palestinian state that has no borders and no designated leadership. And then Britain joined in and said, you know what? Yes, Israel, if you don't solve the humanitarian crisis in Gaza by September, we're going to also recognize this Palestinian state. And I understand that on paper this looks, no, not on paper, because on paper you'd have a lot more details on why this doesn't work. But on TikTok and on Instagram and on these little snippets that people see on the news, this is a fantastic popularity contest, which brings us back to the topic of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Let me just say a couple things. There are areas in Gaza that have a food and water and supplies shortage. There are also areas in Gaza that are functioning properly and post daily the amazing food that they provide in their restaurants. For the areas that are actually experiencing shortages of food and water and supplies, which I might add include the hostages, not where the hostages are, because their guards clearly have plenty of food and there is footage of that, but the hostages themselves are being systematically starved and harmed. In fact, the Ministry of Health just sent their latest findings through the Red Cross, and this is what they had to say. The food and water was expired, rotting food crawling with worms. Hostages were forced to drink contaminated water such as sewage and seawater. They're enduring daily beatings, relentless psychological torture, chronic sexual assault, and sustained trauma. And as a result of this ongoing neglect and the Red Cross not providing them with medicines, the hostages have lost 40% of their body weight and are on the verge of death due to untreated injuries and other medical conditions. Let me say that Hamas is very proud when they film and post footage of the hostages to torment and torture not just the hostages, but their families and the entirety of Israeli culture, who they know cares about life. Again, the issue with the humanitarian aid crisis is entirely Hamas manufactured, and they do it because they know the West will run with it. In fact, the BBC just had a leaked memo that revealed that they are instructing their staff to blame Israel for the hunger in Gaza, regardless of facts. And perhaps here we're getting down to the core issue, which is journalism. The job of journalists is to go out into the field and bring back the facts so that people can process them and come to good decisions. And since we don't have that in Gaza, because not only are the good journalists threatened, and they've testified to being threatened by Hamas if they are to tell the truth, there are others who are terrorists who pose as journalists. And then, of course, when they're taken out by Israel, then it's Israel killed journalists when they're actually killing terrorists. People don't know what's happening in Gaza unless you go there personally. So let me close out with a commentary on a very well-known quote. The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. However, the other way evil can triumph is for people who don't know what they're talking about to go out and make a stand about something they don't know what they're talking about and accidentally side with evil. So I encourage you, be informed before you go out and use your voice to change the world. Until next time, I'm Shani Ferguson. Shalom from Jerusalem.